Hello.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. We haven't been here for a few weeks, but this is hashtag enough. I'm Maya,
I'm Angela.
and we're so happy to have everyone here with us this evening. We're going to have a really, really important, informative show today, or I should say, actually, tonight. Um, Angela, do you want to tell them a little bit about what it's about tonight?
Sure. So tonight we have a special guest. It's going to be Dr. Simmons, and just it started because we wanted to address some of the traumatic things that we're faced with, just like in daily life when we're looking at the internet and looking at the news. So it was like a very organic conversation that led us to exploring deeper how we can handle like the mental health issues that arise just from life nowadays, right? But before we do that, like I think we have to acknowledge what day it is today. Stevie Wonder's
Yes.
birthday.
Yes, Stevie Wonder, the great. It was his birthday this week, and he is definitely a part of the landscape of my life. He's some of his songs are like the voices that are in my head when I'm going through things. And I just grew up in a home where him and Luther. That was what was on in my house.
Girl,
So, what's your favorite Stevie Wonder song?
So my favorite Stevie Wonder song was actually a song that was played during my wedding, which was "The Ribbon in the Sky," which probably everyone from like 1980 to 1990 had that song somewhere in their wedding.
That is very true.
Different. That is just my favorite. But I love I can't think of any song that I don't like actually by Stevie Wonder. I love him.
Yes, I love I Just Call to Say I Love You. I don't know if that was like the title.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yes, I remember my grandmother walking around the house dancing to it, and that's when I learned that all Black people do not have rhythm. But just watching my grandmother, but she loved that song, and I love that song too. So she would be so mad that I said that, but it's okay. She'll get over it. So I want to just really quickly. We're so lucky to have Dr. Williametta Simmons with us tonight. Definitely don't want to hear what we have to say about it, but you definitely want to hear what she has to say about the subject. She's a licensed psychologist with over 15 years of experience in the mental health field. She obtained her doctorate in psychology and master's in business administration with a concentration in healthcare management from Widener University. She also has like a bazillion different specializing things, and like she's just very, very amazing. And we're just so lucky to have her here. So thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for having me, ladies. You look great.
You're making us feel good because you look great, yeah. Dr. Simmons. Not only are you the professional we needed to have this conversation with, but you're also gracing our show with beauty. So we appreciate you being here.
Thank you. And happy birthday, Stevie.
Yes. So let's get into it. Angela, I know you had a question that you wanted us to start off with.
Yeah, so our first question, and this came from a conversation that we had with our producers. So, as we watch the internet and we parent and we participate in the community, we are constantly bombarded with images of Black people being killed, dying, being harassed. And so it's traumatic. It's so traumatic that sometimes we can't even watch it. A lot of us don't watch them, or we selectively watch them. And so I just wondered, what advice do you have for us in dealing with that?
Yeah. I mean, we are definitely bombarded with so many images, and we're obviously, if you're Black and you're brown, and you look like us, we're prone to being affected by the images that we see. And it makes sense because we pretty much are seeing ourselves or people that look like us, right? And it hits too close to home. So as far as advice, there are a number of things that I suggest people do. Number one is go on a news diet or a social media diet to the extent that you can. I think it's important to be able to minimize some of your intake, because too much of that can really, penetrate our souls and our spirit. And before you know it, you're thinking about it all the time, and it really shifts the way you look at people and the way you look at the world. So that's one big way we can do it, right? I think other things to do is to try to balance all the negativity with some positive things in your lives, so maybe studying or coming up with a gratitude list. What are the things I'm grateful for? Another might be surrounding yourself with loved ones and friends, laughing, watching a movie. I think ultimately it comes down to self-care, because at this particular time, with all that we see, we have to be very mindful to guard our space, our emotional space, our spiritual space. And the best way to do that is to kind of care for ourselves.
I think that's really important. I know I do want to say that, especially because of social media, but also the news, just because you're not Black or brown, it's still traumatic seeing these deaths or beatings or whatever. It's still very traumatic watching humans. It's different when it's the movies. I can watch action movies all day long, not affected at all. I love action movies. It's my favorite genre. It's very different when I watch something and I know that it's real. I know that it's a real person. And then learning about the person through an article or their parents or their family talking, it makes it even harder for me. I have friends who are not Black or brown who have nightmares, and so I think that I think it's a human issue too. You don't just have to be a person of color, although it hits us completely differently. But decent individuals who care about humans, I think feel something, and I just wanted to acknowledge that really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely, couldn't be more true, right? I like to say the humanity we share is way, way more valuable than our differences in terms of our melanin, how much or how little we have. Being humans run deep inside of all of us. And so people, like you said, decent human beings will feel something when they see something like that. I think we probably all have friends or, even family members that are of different race, or maybe they're mixed and so forth and so on, that feel the same kind of hurt or similar hurt. And it is important to recognize that as human beings, we are vulnerable to these types of emotional trauma.
So how do I know? I'm just like sitting at home on my Facebook all the time. How do I know that I'm maybe consuming a little bit too much? Like what are the signs that would tell a regular person like me I need to step back?
That's a good question. The first thing that comes to my mind is the extent to which it's consuming your life, right? So if I realize that maybe initially I spent an hour on Facebook, but now it's 3 hours on Facebook, between Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever, and Twitter. And even when I'm off of it, I'm still thinking about it. I think that's a sign. But sometimes we'll have what we call visceral or physiological response. Like you'll feel your heart getting just pounding as you're watching this, or your hands are, kind of getting a little bit more sweaty, or your shoulders get a little bit tense. You're carrying the stress in your body. It usually is a sign. The other you mentioned earlier, which is when you start having nightmares about it, or you even start looking at other people in a very suspicious kind of way, maybe someone that doesn't look like you're like, are you thinking negative thoughts about me, or what are you plotting? I think that's a sign that maybe it's time to dial back just a little bit. So those are just a few of many other signs.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure I've experienced those things, all of those things. So that's helpful.
Could I add something really quickly? I'm sorry. I'm trying to be mindful of time, so I'm like, just hit 1 or 2 points at a time. But I was just going to say that people experience trauma or those injuries in different ways. So for some people, I talked about there being tension in your shoulder, but some will find themselves being more prone to migraine headaches or being more prone to GI issues. All of those are ways in which like we're holding something in our emotional space that needs to be let out. So I just wanted to add those points really quickly.
Actually, that resonated with me because 2 of my children who are like one's 19 or 18, I think. And one, I said, I think, because I have so many, I'm sorry. And one is 7, but they both have stomach issues. And, when their stomach is hurting, it took me a long time to figure out, I needed to ask, how are you feeling? What's going on? What's wrong? And I didn't figure that out until my 7-year-old was about 5. And I was like, darn, wish I knew that a decade ago with the other one. But that is exactly it. And I noticed that for myself too.
And kids don't always have the language for what's going on for them. So it will show itself behaviorally, like maybe they're more isolated or angry or mad, or they're like, oh, I have a tummy ache or I have a headache. And it's really important that we're mindful that kids manifest their anxiety in a different way than we would, and we can put words to it, but they may not always be able to put words to it.
That brings me to my question I was going to ask about children. So I think that this is a special, it's an especially difficult time to raise children, especially Black and brown children, because they're so exposed to these images, which, in my time, I was not, right? So what can we do as parents, as teachers, family members, to help, knowing that it's going to have an impact on their mental health? It does, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely does. I know some parents have said, I try to shield them as much as possible. To the extent that you can, that if it's adaptable for your family and your style, that's okay. But I think that it's important to have a frank conversation with our children about what's going on, because who better for them to hear it from, right? It's better that they hear it from mom, from dad, from aunt, from grandma, about the fact that, listen, because of the color of your skin or because of the way you dress, other people might see you a certain way, so be mindful of that. But these are some things you can do in the event that something happens. Nothing is 100% foolproof, right? So just be calm, follow the instructions of whomever, depending on the age of the kid, let me know if I'm around, if it's like a little school age kid. And sometimes I have seen parents come in and tell me about their children experiencing racial type discriminations within the school. So then we have to have those conversations. Let mom and dad know, don't keep it in, or whoever your caregiver is, don't hold it in and punch Mary in the face, write it down and bring it, and bring it to me, or even text me or call me, go to the principal's office, those kinds of things. If it's a teenager, you definitely have to have that frank preteen, teen, frank conversation as blatantly as possible. And what do you need to do so that, we wrong place, wrong time, but to the extent that we can control our environment to make sure that we're doing those things as well.
So what are the signs? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask you, because, often I have teenagers and, 18-year-olds. And so I'm not in control. As much as I would love to shield them, I'm not in control of what they see. So are there any signs that, your kids might be disturbed by, aside from what you've already said, I'm sure with adults, the physical manifestations sometimes, are there any other signs that, you should be concerned that your kid is absorbing too much?
Yes. So for teenagers, you might see that they are, in some kids, depending on their personality, they might be more isolated, spend more time in their room, spend more time on video games, spend less time with parents. I don't want to be bothered with you. Of course, part of that is teenagery behavior, but your kid's baseline, and that, wait a minute, something's off, Sometimes you might find that with our teens, they get a little bit more snappy, like out of nowhere. Oh, here you are, my straight A student, you were doing great, and now you're all F's. And when I approach you about it, whereas before you would sit down and say, okay, mom, I need to tell you about this. You're like, what? Why are you always on me? So all of a sudden it goes from we can converse to we have no conversations, so those are some of the more typical signs that I see with our teenagers. And then for the little ones, pay attention to their artwork and their story, their little narratives, because sometimes what they are thinking shows itself in the artwork. So, there might be a person on the ground with blood, or the person's like all black with like a stabbing or whatnot. Use art. I think a lot of times what I do with kids is I use art to kind of draw out their narrative and what it is that's happening on the inside of them.
Thank you.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Absolutely. Um, do you think at all? I feel like social media can be helpful, especially
Mm-hmm.
because we were in a pandemic and you couldn't get out and you couldn't go
Yeah.
anywhere. I took COVID very seriously, and I'm a worrywart anyway. So I was scared. There was weeks I didn't leave my house.
Yeah.
So I crafted my social media around supporting groups. Groups that were supportive and positive, and pictures of puppies and kittens.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yep.
that's what I like. But I mean, I think social media can, even though it's also hurting us a little bit and maybe giving us some shared trauma, I think that also, don't you think it can be a little bit helpful?
Well, there's a key word you used there. You said crafted. And that's important because you have to be intentional about what's on your feed. If you're following a whole bunch of stuff that you know is going to be emotionally arousing, it's not helpful. But if you're intentional about crafting, and actually that's something that I caution people to do a lot, make sure you have me. If you find that you're getting depressed, go back and rethink who you're following and what interests you're following, and craft it, make it a sign, or make it designed rather in such a way that it's more positive in nature and more uplifting in nature. So what we see, or what we feed our souls and what we feed ourselves, is going to affect how we feel. So you've taken the leap and you're ahead of the game because you're deliberate in making sure that what's on your feed aren't a bunch of shootings, killing, and negative conversations, but rather they're things that feed your spirit and lifts you up. So that's what I would say. Social media is effective and adaptive when you're tailoring it to fit your need in a healthy way.
Okay. I just had a question that just popped in my head, and I'm just curious how people who are back at the workplace,
Mm-hmm.
how are they dealing with our shared trauma, with seeing the violence perpetrated on citizens by officers, or by citizens and citizens, like just seeing, like with the rise in Asian hate, those type of videos and stuff.
Yeah.
So some of us work in a place that's not very tolerant, or our coworkers aren't awesome, and
Mm-hmm.
they'll hear things at the water cooler or with the copy machine or whatever. So how do you I don't even understand how people are dealing with that. What do they do?
That's such a loaded question. When you asked it, I was like, oh man, this is a multi-layered one. It's what I would say is, the reality is we're not on the same page when it comes to the way in which, Black and indigenous people of color are treated. There are some of our coworkers that's like, oh well, they shouldn't have been smoking weed, or they shouldn't have said no, or there are some coworkers that will justify the violence that's done to our bodies. And then you have coworkers that's like, this is horrible. It is unacceptable. We're marching, we're doing what we need to do. I would say find yourself a support group, within amongst your coworkers, the folks that share similar perspective as you. It's not a bad idea to kind of talk it through. There's a little bit of a risk that I would suggest. It's never a bad thing to hear from the other's perspective as well. Those that are like, the cops are doing their job. My dad is a cop, and if he probably would have done the same thing. It's hard to have those conversations when people have very different perspective as you, but it's really good because you can think about, oh, this is where you're coming from, and what is there a middle ground? And it challenges you, it forces you to think outside of your usual way of thinking, like, I am right in my belief and they're wrong, so first, find your support system, people with shared ideas. Then try to see if you can reach over to the other side of the aisle, and find a common ground and have a good discourse around what's going on.
That's good. I'm not there yet.
I know.
God is not done with me.
It's really hard.
It is really hard. It's hard. It's hard even when you're virtual, because it's business as usual, even though something really traumatic or tragic is happening, right?
Yeah.
So you have to split yourself into two, basically like two different personalities to handle work, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that's even hard. But I think you brought up a good point. You sort of what you're advocating is you craft an environment that is supportive, but at the same time, you know, we do embrace activism, right? So you have to put yourself in those uncomfortable spaces mentally and physically sometimes. And so do you have any advice for people who are trying to, you know, make sure that to hear, let voices be heard that have not been heard, and not shy away from the things that are really, you know, plaguing our society right now, that are violent and disturbing?
As it relates to kind of listening to the other side,
Or just how do you persevere?
Yeah.
You have to put yourself in that space, and we want people to, in the sense that we want them to elevate the voices of the disenfranchised, of the people who are suffering the most. And so we can't not hear them and not see them, right? We can't shield ourselves all the time. So I was just wondering, how do you handle that?
Yeah. A lot of role play in my head. Like a lot of role, like I always say, if there was my head is a whole reality show all by itself. There's so much happening in there. Yeah, right. And like sometimes I'm just cracking up, like, who thinks like this lady? But I whenever I have to have difficult conversations, I rehearse it, I role play it, I kind of think about, okay, well, what if they say this? Then what am I gonna do? I think it's worth having those conversations with yourself first and preparing for, what the other side may say before having that conversation. The other thing I would say is being deliberate about listening, but listening with an intent to understand as opposed to listening with an intent to respond. And I always, most of us listen with an intent to respond, because the person's talking and we're passively listening. We can't wait to just tell them, but you don't understand, this is what's happening. But when we listen with an intent to understand, we suspend our judgments, we suspend our thoughts, and we just listen. And it makes it easier for us to kind of catch those little nuggets of information that's really meaningful, and maybe even find an area where we're like, okay, well, we agree on this thing. Now, how do we move forward with advocacy? Know your own limits too, because you talked about preservation, and I thought, Angela, that's a good word right there, because we have to survive, so maybe you're limiting how often you're having this activism kind of conversation. Maybe it's, once a month I can have the conversation, as opposed to every day, because the truth be told is emotionally draining, and it's physically draining, it's mentally draining. So you kind of have to know yourself and know your own limit. Always monitor yourself. Yeah.
I just want to say, completely off topic, but in my reality show, in my head, my best friend is Gail, not Oprah, because she's a little bit too bougie for me, but Gail. Yeah. But because I just love Gail. But you know, down
to earth and just easy going,
Yeah, she's hilarious. I love her. her. But I think it's good to know that someone like you has a show in your head, and I have one. Someone like me, so I'm normal, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, you're very normal. It just means we have active imagination, and that's fine. That in our imaginations, problems are solved, so it's all good.
Yeah, and I think we all have so many commonalities to one another, and little differences here and there, but we're all experiencing the shared trauma, and it's really hard, and you got to do whatever can keep you going. I always want people to be an activist, but not at not at your own detriment. So if you need to limit it, I do think that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah. And there are different ways in which you can be an activist. Maybe sometimes it's through writing, writing an op-ed, because now I'm not having to talk and confront. It's cathartic to write, and you've given yourself time to think through what you want to say, and you're thoughtfully expressing everything that you feel without necessarily that added pressure of the other person in front of you, maybe attacking you or giving a counter, like a rebuttal. So there are different ways that we can get creative with activism.
And I think also, I know we're not in church, but I felt convicted when you were talking about, suspend your judgment.
Mhm.
and listen to understand. Yeah,
Yeah.
don't do that either. So I have to definitely work on that skill, because I
Yeah.
also, I think I might come away feeling differently than I have before,
Mhm.
because I am actually trying to understand. And even if I don't win or they don't change, maybe I
Mhm.
have a little bit better understanding and I don't feel as maybe dismissed or just
Mhm.
anxiety filled.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we have a question
Sure.
before we go. Is there a such thing as, I think it's vicarious trauma or
Yes.
or precarious
Yeah.
trauma. I think it's
Yeah.
well, you tell me what it
Vicarious.
is. What is it?
It's vicarious trauma. It's vicarious trauma, and there is such a thing. It's basically, the emotional injury that we feel from watching other people go through traumatic experiences. Again, human beings, regardless of what we look like on the outside, we have mirror neurons that kind of pulls for our emotions, and for us to have empathy. So when we witness other people going through something, that's why, if someone hit their knee on a door, you'll be like, ouch, because you just felt that thing that person felt. And it's very instinctual within us. But vicarious trauma is what happens when we ourselves become traumatized by what we're witnessing.
That
Okay.
makes sense.
It does
That's
make
what we're
sense.
all experiencing
Yes.
in these
Absolutely.
Yes.
days. In this
Yeah.
time.
Well, I absolutely need to thank you for coming on, Dr. Simmons. It's clear you're an expert in the field and you know your stuff, but it's incredibly helpful because our viewers and ourselves can take this information, give it to friends, utilize it with family, and hopefully share this type of information. This has been a wonderful session. What do you think, Angela?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you so much for coming. And also, I just want to make the point too, and I'm sure you would make this point too, Dr. Simmons, that sometimes you actually have to really get some help. And you might, if you're having any kind of suicidal thoughts or something like that, we are posting the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number for you, and also encourage people to take care of your mental health as much as you take care of your physical health, or more so if you're not taking care of your physical health. Do both, right? They're connected, and it's so important just in terms of our wellness, our general well-being. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. We really enjoyed this conversation. I feel so much smarter.
My pleasure. Beautifully stated that last thing about taking care of our mental health as well as we do our physical health. So yeah.
Absolutely. So we have to wrap it up. I want to thank everybody for being with us this week. We will be back in 2 weeks. Thank you so much. I'm backstage.